Chapter 12. Unmasked. Friday, 9 a.m. Behind the Great Wall.
Incompetent,
Artemis thought to himself.
Why didn't he look around before attacking? How could he make such a blunder? And if that was not bad enough, he was recognized and then defeated by Zeal. If Design or even the lieutenant had been spies here, such serious and ridiculous blunders would not have been made.
Artemis thought listlessly to himself.
If I am very careful, I can get out of here without discovery. Or perhaps, better yet, use rhetoric to achieve my ends. But it will not be easy. This campaign has been botched by foolishness and carelessness. If they eventually fade, Radiants will hopefully jog training into those useless failures who call themselves spies. This disaster could have been prevented if they had been careful and conscientious. I'll see to it that they remain privates for 20 years. What they need is a severe beating. Infuriating. Such incompetence has crippled my effectiveness in this castle. But I have something better than a sword.
Smiling coldly, he put his hand into his pack and drew out something more dangerous to Finite Castle than the swords his subordinate spies used. Friday, 9:15 a.m. The Marble Square. All the residents who were not on guard duty were gathered around Head Inspector Perceive as he drew up the document that would go to Theopolis by the Gatehouse of Speech. The spy, Ploy, who looked very dejected and miserable, stood nearby in shackles.
You know what I am surprised about?
Said Resident Averse in a casual manner. What's that? Asked Resident Candid.
Nobody has brought up the idea of Perceive being replaced by Rye as acting head inspector. If you agreed on Rye as the acting head inspector, we would not have to worry about the obligations and stagnant boredom that will surely be the result of a rescue from the king. A lot of us would be behind you, Rye, if you were willing to proceed with such a prudent course of action.
The other residents gaped in stunned silence as Resident Averse made this suggestion. Clearing his throat and shaking his head, Head Inspector Perceive spoke his thoughts.
Allow me to remind you all, particularly the instigator of such an idea that I give up my position, that Head Inspector's orders remain final whether he is absent or not.
Before going on, he remembered his last conversation with Head Inspector Cautious.
Allow me to acquaint you with the last conversation I had with Head Inspector Cautious before he left.
When this was said, everyone listened with rapt attention. Resident Perceive, I am telling you this because I will be departing this castle soon for a visit to Victor Castle. Not that I am expecting an attack anytime soon. I know that there are spies in this castle, but I have been unable to determine the spies from the normal residents. They act and speak in an identical way that neither of them likes the king.
Perhaps, Head Inspector, if we knew for sure who they were, we could come up with a device to ensnare them.
You will know spies because they will resist efforts to call on the king and will also make a big deal about how big and strong the wall is. If it has been a while since the attack has begun, they will begin to say that the castle has gone too far for the king to rescue them, particularly if the wall has become weaker. If their cause appears lost to them, they will clamor to replace you with the resident who is reluctant to call on the king. Desperation will drive them to this measure, because they will face severe punishment for their failure.
There are some in this castle with a malicious intent. There are those who wish us well to our face one moment and then plot our misery the next. A droid over there claimed to be a resident, and those of you who will remember will recall that he entered these gates claiming he was the wearer of affluence, which is a nice but not necessary wear. He requested to be a resident some years ago, and his request was granted. Yet he tried to attack Resident Aspire here to prevent him from informing us about the plaques, which had prevented the enemy, Pernicious, from breaking in. He also made the absurd claim that the king would not rescue us, since we had delayed in asking for rescue.
Yes, even though he has been against the idea of calling on the king.
Resident Grace replied.
Yes, Grace, his purpose was our destruction and downfall, yet there is another individual I know to be a spy, and his goal has been the same.
As Resident Perceive went on, Resident Rye and Resident Candid looked questioningly at him.
You can't seriously be thinking that 2 spies have gotten past these gates,
replied Resident Candid.
It is not possible that 2 bad character traits could get past us.
It is sadly true and totally possible,
replied Head Inspector Perceive with a dispirited nod.
Yet another spy remains in our midst, who, in cahoots with former Resident Adroit over there, has plotted our misery and demise in cooperation with Pernicious Accuser. I have suspected him for a while, but his suggestion that I be replaced was the last straw in a desperate measure to prevent the king from protecting us.
I am not a spy,
cried Resident Rye indignantly.
I oppose the king, but I would not dare to disobey Head Inspector Cautious, even though I don't always see eye to eye with him.
He was not referring to you, Inspector Rye,
replied Resident Aspire. While Resident Rye was talking, young Resident Astute sprinted up out of breath with a pair of shackles. Panting, he handed them to Head Inspector Perceive.
Resolve and presume,
he said as he tossed the shackles to them.
Put these on a verse there. Don't think that your ruse of pretending to disagree with former Resident Adroit will fool anyone anymore. This tactic will no longer cover your tracks. Your ruse and time in this castle are over. You're going to have to report to your boss that you have failed, and I hope he punishes you severely. Seize him.
How do you know that Resident Averse and perhaps Adroit are spies?
Resident Rye asked hesitantly.
Perhaps you could be mistaken.
I am not mistaken, Rye. Let us review his actions as well as those of former Resident Adroit. He came in as a frivolous wearer, as did Resident Adroit, and requested to be a resident.
I would hardly describe the wear of pride, not to mention affluence frivolous wares. Are we to have any influence with other castles without these wares?
Questioned Resident Rye.
They are often taken too far so that they do more harm than good. They are frivolous next to wares such as wisdom, patience, love, kindness, integrity, and honesty,
replied Resident Resolve.
And if it comes to affluence and rapport with other castles, the wares Resident Resolve here mentioned will be far more effective in determining the quality of our relationship with other castles,
replied Resident Grace.
As you will recall, whenever the king comes up in a subject, they change the subject or bring up wild, unconfirmed rumors about him, whereas the real residents who oppose him merely express their distaste for the king. I have noticed this in several conversations I have taken part in. And once the plaques were up, they claimed that the plaques were needed, but not the king. Then once we made this choice to call on the king, the suggestion was made that I be replaced by someone who sided in sentiment with them, even though those who now trust the king outnumber those who do not.
Resident Rye, taking in a quick breath, looked uneasily at former residents Averse and Adroit, and then stepped away, looking very uncomfortable.
Head Inspector,
replied Resident Resolve.
We should throw them to the grindstone mercy of their leader instead of detaining them. Nothing we could do would be worse for them.
Traitors,
Resident Rye said in quiet rage.
What are your real names? Like we're really going to tell you, O most noble cohort,
replied Resident Averse.
I never would have guessed that this would go so far.
Resident Procure replied, shaking his head in disbelief as he walked up.
You would have had me clamor for the misery and defeat of my own home and castle. Had Inspector Perceive and anyone else forgive me for taking sides with the enemy, I never guessed they were not residents. I say, we expel them now,
Resident Rye said between clenched teeth. Resident Procure winked and tossed him an apple.
Resident Resolve and Presume, grab former Resident Averse and throw him over the wall.
Resident Resolve and Resident Presume came forward, and each taking a hold on former Resident Averse's cloak, attempted to pull him towards the wall. With ease, the spy shoved Resident Presume into a tree several feet away, and Resident Resolve onto the ground.
What is wrong, brave residents?
He said mockingly. At this, Residents Rye and Candid, not too far away, both strode over and took a hold of former Resident Averse in an attempt to drag him towards the stairs. Ploy, who was former Resident Adroit, easily broke the shackles that bound him. He then walked up and removed Resident Rye's grip from former Resident Averse. He then tossed Rye into the fountain not too far away. Guys easily shoved Resident Candid away to where he fell by the trunk of the tree, looking slightly dazed. Resident Aspire stepped back, aware that he could do little to them. At this point, Resident Rye, who was not injured, stuck his head out of the fountain. At that, the two spies began to walk towards Head Inspector Perceive.
Why were his hands so cold?
Resident Resolve asked himself as he slowly got up.
You were not going to toss us out, acting head inspector. By assimilation, we are residents of this castle. Replied Ploy, who was panting. We began as wares, and so will commend you as residents you have allowed us to become.
What perfect actors you two are. I'm not sure Head Inspector Perceive. Why is it that they are having trouble with their speech all of a sudden?
Yes, residents resolve.
I had no idea that bad character traits could be so much stronger than real residents.
Replied Resident Grace in a lamenting tone.
Yes, resident Grace.
Former Resident Averse replied.
Now we can live peaceably together in this castle, or in continually fighting against us, you can forget what peace of mind is like. Surrender to us whom you call spies and bad character traits, because we are residents now, and we might as well live as peacefully as we can. You have no choice, and there is nothing you can do to change us from the residents we have become back in the West.
I hate to admit this, but we have allowed this to happen by not guarding the 5 gates of the castle well enough. I'm glad Head Inspector Cautious is not here to see our failure, replied Resident Presume.
Very true, very true.
Adroit laughed as he and Averse approached Head Inspector Perceive.
Maybe, Perceive, these shackles will fit you better than you intended them to fit me, broken as they are.
Ploy said as he picked them up about 5 paces from Perceive. Though the two approached him, led by Ploy, he did not budge.
Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and to overcome all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you.
Suddenly, Ploy stopped and fell to the ground as light from a plaque hit him. He covered his eyes with a gasp and, squinting out of them, looked at Resident Aspire, who held a plaque in his hand and was reflecting the sun's light on him as the verse was spoken. Guise was not in the beam of light and ran directly at Resident Aspire to stop him, but before he reached Resident Aspire, he too fell on the ground. There has no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that which you are able, but will with the temptation make a way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. Squinting, he saw that Resident Rye had a plaque which he was struggling to hold up while he read the verse.
Hey, when the light of the sun from the plaques is on them, they are wearing the same uniforms those soldiers outside were wearing.
So they really are servants of the accuser.
Resident Grace exclaimed.
We may not be able to see well, but who needs to see well in order to slash with a sword?
The spy Ploy replied as he reached for his sword and got up unsteadily.
Creator King, in your name, please help us.
Resident Aspire called out with his eyes lifted upwards. Right after Resident Aspire said this, Alien Zeal was between the two spies and Head Inspector Perceive. At this, Ploy, who could barely see, drew his sword. Would you like to be defeated in broad daylight, Adroit? Or should I say, Ploy?
So that is his real name?
Resident Grace remarked. Ploy did not say anything, but appeared to hesitate. Walking forward unsteadily, Guise drew his sword and quickly approached Alien Zeal, unsteadily, still half blinded by the light Resident Aspire directed on him. Glancing at Head Inspector Perceive, Alien Zeal replied, There is power and strength and love in the name of Creator King, Jesus. As soon as he said this name, the two spies shuddered and fell back as if a shock wave had hit both of them. An enraged look crossed their still half-blinded eyes.
Don't say that name. We can't stand it.
Ploy uttered in a frenzied tone as he trembled violently.
What do you have to say now, Traitor Zeal?
Ploy cried as they got up and closed in on him, swords drawn.
In your name, Creator King, Jesus, please help us.
Head Inspector Perceive said in a calm, earnest tone. The next thing the residents saw was two more emissaries, Bold and Constant, next to Alien Zeal. All three of them had drawn swords.
Well, I'm ever glad that you emissaries were nearby.
His real name is Ploy,
Replied Emissary Bold, pointing at him whom they had formerly known as Adroit. He was still a little half-blinded from the effect of the plaque, and he was shivering and sneezing as well.
Yes, and this one here is Guy's.
Replied Emissary Constant, who still had her sword trained on the individual they had formerly known as Averse. He was also shivering and trying not to sneeze. Surrounded by the emissaries with drawn swords, the shivering and sneezing spies showed no interest in retaliation.
Would it be too much to ask you, emissaries, if you could keep them in check for a while? There is something we need to do.
Yes, Head Inspector Perceive. You want us to keep them company while you make a communication to Theopolis, correct?
Why are they shivering so much?
Asked Resident Grace.
Wait a minute,
Cried Resident Rye.
why is it that we can understand these aliens all of a sudden? Why are they no longer jabbering in silent tones?
You are right, Rye, breathed Resident Candid with a vague expression. No one had noticed, but the breeze had turned into a wind in the immediate vicinity of the spies and the emissaries. Even so, none but the spies were shivering and sneezing. No sooner had Resident Candid replied to Resident Rye than a gush of wind blew straight at Resident Rye. It easily ruffled his wavy hair and caused his garments to flit in the wind. At that moment, a eureka look emerged in Resident Rye's startled face. He exchanged an anxious yet wondering look with Resident Candid before going on.
Maybe it is better for me not to know at this point.
And Mr. Zeal, is what they said about spies being genuine residents of this castle really true?
But how are we going to get rid of them? We do not want them here.
Resident Resolve replied, obviously disappointed.
Have you noticed the breeze? Have you noticed them shivering?
Well, Alien Constant, I have noticed and enjoyed the breeze. Also, they do seem to be shivering as well as sneezing.
And you must have noticed that their enunciation has changed.
Come to think of it, I did notice that their enunciation is off some.
Resident Aspire remarked.
You do not get away with this.
What did Adroit or Ploy say?
Replied Resident Rye, who was wringing out his cloak.
I never had any problems understanding them before. How is it the Resident Resolve is not translating, but we have been able to understand these aliens?
The winds have changed, my friend.
Replied Alien Bold with a slap on Resident Rye's back.
You miserable, dirty, pitiful residents! We will have recompense for this injury. When you are under us, it will be of the right and a thrill to make you miserable.
I shall derive much delight and pain at the suffering you will face for deriving radiance. I await your soon approaching death with eager anticipation, and I look forward to seeing your bleached, severed bones scattered in some dry desert. You will die bereft of hope and salvation, biopoetics residence, cursed be by thy castle. We will have our revenge.
Ploy replied, trying desperately to properly enunciate.
There shall be great revenge for this great wrong.
Guy said in tears of desperation, fear, and anger.
Why can't they speak louder?
Resident Aspire wondered out loud.
May radiance fool you and destroy you someday.
Replied Ploy with a cruel laugh, which is followed by Guy's.
Yes, well, now you will be accompanied by these good emissaries and their swords to the other side of the castle while we conduct important business regarding the king.
Resident Grace replied. At this, Resident Procurer tossed an apple to Junior Resident Astute with an approving nod. Suddenly, Lord Mysterious was in their midst. No one except Resident Aspire knew him, but they were all struck by his white, flowing garments that were animated by the wind.
Who is this?
Asked Resident Leary, and how did he get in our midst without anyone noticing him?
Nothing will surprise me anymore,
replied a wet Resident Rye who was studying the stranger.
Do not be so sure, Resident Rye.
The stranger replied with a smile and a twinkle in his eyes. How do you know me? Resident Rye asked, looking surprised. They all suddenly noticed that Resident Aspire was bowing respectfully to the person. Why are you bowing like that? Asked Resident Lurie when he noticed that Resident Resolve was bowing too.
This is Lord Mysterious.
When Resident Aspire said this, the residents looked at each other and, one by one, began to bow, ending with Resident Rye, who looked like he had slow reflexes.
The King of Theopolis has invited you, Finite Castle, into a relationship of trust and friendship. Please get up.
The residents arose hesitantly one by one. As they did, Lord Mysterious began walking towards the fountain for no apparent reason. The residents followed him, glancing at one another and not sure of what to expect next.
You have wasted valuable time in arguing. Your first course of action should always be to call on the king. Also, this castle has a serious flaw, which none of you know about.
He got some curious and surprised looks when he said this. He was next to the fountain at this point, and he pointed to the bench part of it. Slowly, Resident Aspire came forward and touched the stone seat that Lord Mysterious was pointing to.
Lift up the edge, Resident Aspire.
When with raised eyebrows he applied pressure to the bottom of the overlapping edge, it came up, much to the surprise of the other residents. Stepping back with her hands on her mouth, Resident Grace exclaimed,
A secret tunnel?
A ladder went down into darkness. Resident Aspire and Resolve, along with Resident Procure, who was scratching his head, looked into the darkness. Then he handed an apple to Junior Resident Astute.
So that is how some of them got in,
replied Resident Resolve.
We might have known that there was a secret passage in this castle. Perhaps we did not want to admit to ourselves that our castle had such shortcomings, that it had such a weakness, that it could be infiltrated,
he said, wagging his head sadly.
This tunnel is called Conscience, and it is through here that some spies managed to enter when your gates were closed,
replied Lord Mysterious.
Creator King will himself take care of this flaw in your castle, in your character. He personally will be filling it with mortar.
Lord Mysterious, earlier on, did you mean that some have gotten through our gates without the aid of this tunnel? Resident Rye respectfully asked.
Yes, that is correct. Another thing, as I'm sure you know, the spies you knew as adroit and averse were in fact ploy and guise. You need to request the king that their influence will not survive after them. If you try to block this tunnel in of yourselves, then perhaps more will come back under different names. You need to depend on the king in this respect. He will personally see to filling in and blocking this secret passage, though you will not actually see him do it.
Is it possible that an agent of Pernicious is still in the castle undiscovered?
You are correct, Resident Aspire. There is an agent of the enemy here who is unknown to you.
I think I know who it is, and he got in through the gate of hearing,
replied Resident Aspire. Everyone suddenly gaped at Resident Aspire.
There's no one left but residents,
replied Resident Candid.
Who else could possibly be a spy?
Before Resident Aspire could reply, Resident Grace directed everyone's focus on Resident Procure with a question. He was sweating profusely. His face was a shade paler and his eyes looked bloodshot. He was also trying not to shiver. When they looked at him, he had just succeeded in suppressing a violent sneeze.
Is something wrong, Procure? You don't look so good. You are sweating a lot, and it is not even noon yet. How can you be cold when it is so warm?
He was following a distance behind with the look of someone trying to control himself.
Are you feeling all right, Procure?
Questioned Resident Grace again when he did not answer.
I am not sure. I don't feel right. Not sick, you understand, but just weird. Perhaps if I take a walk, I'll be all right.
Before he could take off, Resident Aspire continued with what he had been saying.
Like had Inspector perceive, I have been putting puzzle pieces together for some time. Resident Procure here is not who he says he is.
There were some gasps from some residents as they looked at Resident Aspire, and then at Resident Procure, and then back at Resident Aspire. Can you substantiate this? Asked Head Inspector Perceive.
I'm given to understand that spies masquerading as residents have telltale signs in their behavior when Lord Mysterious is around. His behavior matches the description I was given from Resident Alert in Victory Castle about the spies who were unmasked there. When I was in Victory Castle, Alert told me the spies in that castle display the same behavior when around Lord Mysterious as Procurer here does.
Is there anything else you can use to confirm this? Resident Wright asked with a brow raised.
Well, there's more. From a great distance in the early morning, I observed him talking to the spies we just dealt with in a buddy-buddy manner about twice. And now you all know that those two and Resident Procure have been at each other's throats as supposed banters, but as Head Inspector perceived, deduced. What if it was a ruse?
As he replied, Resident Procure, in a kind manner, laid his hand on Resident Aspire's shoulder, which made him wince.
You are a good resident, Aspire. You exemplify the duty of being on guard against possible threats in your castle. And my feelings toward those spies at present are anything but buddy-buddy. I would personally enjoy observing whatever punishment they will get for all the problems they have caused in this castle. However, don't worry, residents. I do not take his position personally. It is partly because of him that your walls have been preserved despite the fact that there is still the continually annoying boom boom. No hard feelings.
Wait a second,
Resident Candid commented as he drew nearer to Resident Procure.
I know who you are. You are or were the regent of Asunder Castle. I had a chat with Resident Sharp when I was there 2 months ago, just after its defeat, and you were around ruling it as if it was your personal castle. I was only there for a short time before you went on some errand, and in that amount of time I was able to tell that the products of Asunder Castle under your command were beginning to erode below the lack of quality which was apparent in them before. The residents did whatever they pleased, and it looked like they were enjoying themselves, but I could tell they were not all happy. They looked miserable, actually, but seemed unaware of it. I know I had seen you outside of these walls before, only you did not have a mustache in that castle.
So if he was the regent of Asunder Castle, how could he be a resident here? Asked Resident Leary, who looked somewhat dubious at the idea.
The obvious conclusion is that he went directly from Asunder Castle to be a spy here, whereas most of you know, he as a resident and a vendor have been frequenting on and off for quite some time.
Resident Resolve replied in a sad tone.
It can't be,
Replied Resident Grace.
Head Inspector Cautious trusted him and told me so himself.
How gullible are we? Asked Resident Leary. Is there any way this could be a mistake?
Well, his time of entry right before the attack when he had been away for some time, and then Resident Presume recognizing him from Asunder Castle are two things you can't really explain away.
Replied Resident Resolve. I am sorry about this development, Head Inspector Perceive said to Resident Procure. I thought the whole time that you were a good guy, but the facts are stacked against you, Resident Procure. Even though you are a resident, your arrival here an hour before the attack does make your case appear suspect, and Resident Presume recognizing you from Asunder Castle does not help you at all. At this, Resident Aspire walked quickly away and stood next to Resident Resolve.
For the word of God is quick and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the dividing asunder of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart.
Suddenly, a light from a plaque held and read by Resident Grace shone on former Resident Procure. He cringed while shielding his eyes from the bright light with one hand. Then he put his other hand into his pack and fingered something.
Look at that! He has the same uniforms as those spies in that group outside,
exclaimed Resident Candid.
So there have been 3 spies running around here?
Asked Resident Rye, shaking his head in denial.
You're never safe from surprise till you're dead.
The jig is up, Procure, or whatever your name is, replied Resident Presume.
His name is Artifice. Artifice and Resident Procure are one and the same character.
Artifice looked startled when Resident Candid said this.
Whoever tipped you off Asunder Castle will pay dearly for their mistake.
Well, the evidence is not working in your favor today. We know you were a spy, replied Head Inspector Perceive.
Congratulations, residents of Finite Castle.
Artifice replied with a sarcastic bow and a satirical nod of his head.
You have found me out, although through no fault of mine, but the bumbling of the spies, who are enjoying the company of those interfering emissaries. If not for their shoddy performance, the wool would still be over your dim eyes. However, I do not have any intention, as did my dim-witted cohorts, of using force to extend my stay here.
He fingered something in his pack before bringing it out. As he did, some of the residents looked at his pack and became uneasy, with a few of them backing away. Then he took an apple out of his pack and held it out to them with a calm gaze and a guiltless smile.
It is a mistake to decide that there can't be peaceful coexistence here without something good coming of it.
He replied as he tossed the apple to Resident Candid, who caught it with a look of reluctance. An opened-mouthed Junior Resident Astute looked at the half-eaten apple and then back at Artifice with a slightly dazed look in his eyes. Resident Presume gave a confused glance at Resident Rye, who was still looking at his apple.
If you allow me to stay, I can guarantee that you will see more of what I can bring to your castle. Fruits which you have never tasted and sumptuous fare such as you've never had. My being here with my wares will not detract from your having an alliance with the king, and in doing so, you can have the best of both, the wares I can offer and a relationship with the king.
At this, he took out the apple and in a friendly manner approached Resident Resolve, at which Resident Aspire backed away. Holding it out to Resident Resolve, Artifice continued.
It is foolish to think of any harm coming from a coexistence with me which will not be damaging to your relations with the king, and from which Finite Castle can benefit greatly. I can quietly and peacefully remain an asset to this castle. I am not really an enemy, but a friend in offering you my services in procuring wares that will be well received as well as beneficial here. This is a token of my goodwill towards Finite Castle. Can you really believe that a castle so discerning as Finite could be in danger from me? Can a castle so strong in character seriously worry about any illusions of harm such a vendor as I could cause by procuring wares which you have never enjoyed before? The mistaken idea that any association with me will only bring desolation is contrary to the wisdom apparent in this castle, and the wares that I can offer could only elevate, deepen, and enhance the joy and happiness that is obvious here.
Any strength we may have is the king's and not ours.
Resident Resolve replied, walking up to where he stood close by Artifice.
And what of our discernment?
Replied Head Inspector Perceive.
This is from the king as well.
Very true.
Artifice nodded.
And yet, these virtues now reside in the actions of the residents here, even though from the king. The futility of the enemy in breaking through at this point is obvious, and the proof is the sounds of the weapons you can hear vainly pounding against these walls. Since you are now in essence free from both the grand protagonist and antagonist, you have nothing to fear from me, but something to gain.
Artifice replied, his arm extended with an apple on it and smiling placidly at Resident Resolve. At this point, the eyes of all rested on Resident Resolve. Several seconds went by in silence. A sleepy-looking Resident Aspire felt the apple core in his pocket and looked as though he wanted to say something but could not think of anything to say. Resident Presume shook his head as if trying to clear the mist in it. Resident Rye glanced from the apple in his hand and then back at Resident Resolve.
I've already dined in the room of plaques and am full. I am not persuaded by your subtle and elaborate attempts to subject this castle beneath pernicious accuser. Your oratory skills are no recompense for the misery that would follow if you were permitted to remain. You are in commiseration with the forces outside who have besieged Finite Castle intent on its ruin.
Good for you, Resident Resolve! Shouted Resident Leary, who seemed roused by Resident Resolve's sentiments.
How can we be so crazy as to just stand here and listen to the enemy as he tried to talk us into allowing him to stay?
How indeed, Grace?
Agreed Head Inspector Perceive.
What is wrong with us? We are just standing there allowing him to stay here.
Replied Resident Aspire as he took out the apple core and threw it as far as he could. Well, Finite Castle is my home, and I'm not going to give the enemy one toehold in here for some forbidden wares that will mature into resident spies, replied Resident Rye as he tossed the apple into the fountain. At this, Artifice nodded with an icy look in his eyes.
Aha. Well, if that be the case, do not dupe yourselves into thinking that this is the end. When this generation of residents grow old, we will attack the new one. It is only a matter of the law of averages. Sooner or later, Finite Castle will fall to us despite whatever you can do to prevent it. Your petty resistance is nothing next to our might and wisdom.
It is no comparison to that of the kings, who will soon drive you out,
replied Resident Resolve. Before anyone could say anything else, Artifice sprinted speedily up towards the stairs. Upon reaching the top, from somewhere in his attire, he produced a rope and a hook and quickly secured it to the wall. Before slipping over the edge, he turned to face them.
I know you are going to expel me in the name of the king, so I am leaving before you do. I have no intention of being a useless agent while freezing in this castle when my borders will not constrain me to do so.
It was evident that he was straining to properly enunciate his words.
Someday I shall see the doomed insides of these walls. Only the outcome will be different, and I look forward to it.
He replied, looking down at them. At that, he went over the wall and out of sight.
How did you know what his real name was, Candid?
Asked Resident Resolve.
There are 2 residents there who are loyal to the king in Asunder Castle, even though I was not at the time. Alien Sharp is one. The other was barely a junior resident by the name of Surmise. I am not sure how, but Alien Sharp knew the real name of former resident Procure or Artifice.
But why didn't the emissaries point him out to us?
Resident Grace wondered out loud.
Well,
Head Inspector Perceive began.
it could be that they knew that Lord Mysterious was going to give him away. It seems as if he were planning to stay. Perhaps he thought he was beyond suspicion since the others who had been detained and the emissaries did not say anything to him.
But how do we know there are still no more spies lurking about? Resident Leary asked.
Well, all of us have been exposed to the reflection of the light from the plaques, but none of us have had anything on resembling those uniforms the enemy soldiers had.
Resident Resolve replied.
In the future, let us be sure to heavily scrutinize any wares, ideas, or philosophies that seek entrance and want to become residents.
I think that is a great idea, Head Inspector Perceive,
replied Resident Resolve.
I think that I need to apologize again for all I have done to stall the king.
Resident Rye said sadly.
I know nothing about him, but the enemy's treachery is too much to shrug off. I have been short with you, Resident Aspire, and I have not treated you well. I am sorry.
I would have to admit the same,
replied Resident Candid while rubbing his hands together.
You know what I find interesting?
Resident Grace commented.
What is that, Grace?
Resident Resolve asked.
When they were discovered, they referred to Pernicious as Radiance. So to a degree, they still are in the dark as to his true character.
Perhaps, Resident Leary suggested, perhaps they still refer to each other as they did before their fall to the deception of Pernicious Accuser, but you are right, Grace, they are still deceived. If he has managed to deceive them as smart as they are throughout the millennial ages, what chances do castles have against him without the king?
No chance at all,
Head Inspector Perceive replied, shaking his head with a solemn, consumed expression.
Without the king, all castles would be doomed. We owe him everything.
Yes, we certainly do.
Replied Resident Aspire.
You know, I do not think that Resident Vert has been informed about any developments since his vote was taken to trust the king. Perhaps he should be apprised of the developments.
Oh, you are right, replied Resident Leary. Is young Astute around?
He is on the other side of the fountain,
replied Head Inspector Perceive. At hearing his name, Junior Resident Astute went to the Head Inspector.
Could you go and apprise Resident Avert of all that has taken place?
It will take me a while, Head Inspector, but I will go there and tell him. Maybe I should take a glass of cold water with me. He might be a little surprised.
Very true, only don't spill the water,
he replied with a wink at Astute.
Resident Avert will need as much as he can get after you tell him.
Head Inspector Perceive replied, sharing the joke, with an amused look at Resident Grace. With a nod, Junior Resident Astute took off.
You know,
replied Resident Resolve.
Too bad we won't be able to see Resident Avert's reaction to the news.
We need to do something that we have put off for far too long,
replied Resident Grace.
Oh, right,
said Resident Leary.
Are the ink and parchment and quill here? They are all here,
replied Resident Rye.
Well, let's not lose any more time before we send this petition,
replied Head Inspector Perceive. The walls are still taking a beating. It's a certainty that we would have been defeated by now without the plaques.
Friday, 10 a.m. Outside the walls of Finite Castle. The battering rams had not stopped. They went on boom after boom. From the tent door where the colonel had been observing the attack, the lieutenant cleared his throat.
Yes, what is it?
Artifice is coming this way out of the castle. Coming straight towards the tent, Artifice alighted just outside of it,
I see that you failed.
replied Colonel Devious.
Yes, thanks to those two nitwits.
What do you mean?
I can't tell you when I have seen greater incompetence. They did not confide this in me, but I discovered that they were sneaking around at night on various errands for the head inspector to notice. One of them attacked a residence without checking to see if anyone was watching. 2 residents disappeared without our knowledge. I have never seen more botched and bungled spying in all my days. For their own safety, it is better if they did not see me for a very long time.
Well, when I see them again, you can be sure that they will remain privates for 20 years. You were not to blame, so I will send you back to Asunder Castle. You can leave when you wish.
With that, he bowed to Colonel Devious and took off. Turning in anger towards Finite Castle, he continued.
The attack will continue. We shall not relent or relax. Keep those rams going. Finite Castle believes it can withstand me, does it? We will pound them into submission. I am not going to lose this prize. Finite Castle shall still be in the hands of Radiance. The enemy must not steal another castle. He must not succeed. He must fail at all costs.